Today, we're diving into one of the most pivotal and dramatic events in modern history, the attack on Pearl Harbor. We're going to look at the rising tensions, the shocking failures, and how, in just a couple of hours, one Sunday morning, the entire course of the 20th century was changed forever.
You've definitely heard these words before. They echoed across a totally shocked nation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's speech to Congress just perfectly captured the outrage, the gravity of that moment, and it set the stage for America's plunge into the Second World War. But really, how on earth did it come to this?
All right, so let's get right into it. The attack on Pearl Harbor, it didn't just come out of nowhere. Not at all. It was really the explosive climax of years, and I mean years, of escalating tension between an expanding Japanese empire and a very wary United States. So, as you can see here, things were heating up all through the 1930s while Japan was pushing across Asia. But the real flashpoint, the point of no return, came in July of 1941. The U.S. hit Japan with a crippling oil embargo. Now, you've got to understand, this was a massive deal. Japan was getting something like 80% of its oil from the United States. So, no oil? Their war machine would just grind to a halt. From that moment on, a military showdown felt pretty much inevitable. So Japan's game plan was brutally simple, really. A classic knockout punch. Take out the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one swift blow. Why? To buy themselves time to conquer Southeast Asia and grab all the resources they desperately needed without the Americans getting in their way. Now, the crazy part is, the Americans knew an attack was coming. They weren't totally in the dark. But their fatal miscalculation was where. They thought the strike would hit the Philippines. That was the logical target. Pearl Harbor? No way. It was considered a fortress, too far away, too well defended. It was a tragic, tragic underestimation. Okay, so let's set the scene here. Let's look at the two sides squaring off. On one hand, you have the Imperial Japanese Navy's strike force, steaming across the Pacific in complete radio silence, basically a ghost on the water. And on the other, the might of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sitting peacefully at anchor, a literal sleeping giant with no idea what was about to happen. And this table, well, it tells a fascinating story of a strategic mismatch. Japan's force was built for modern naval warfare. It was centered on 6 powerful aircraft carriers. The U.S. fleet, on the other hand, was all about its 8 massive battleships, all lined up in the harbor. But here's the key detail. Look at this. 0. By an incredible stroke of luck, none of America's aircraft carriers were in port that day. In World War II, carriers were everything, and their absence would turn out to be a critical twist of fate for the United States. And so here we are, the calm, peaceful Sunday morning of December 7th, 1941. The Japanese plan is in motion, and in the space of less than 2 hours, the world is about to change forever. Just after 6 a.m., the first wave of 183 planes launches. Now get this, about an hour and a half later, a new U.S. radar station actually detects this massive formation of planes. But they dismiss it. They figured it had to be a flight of American B-17 bombers that were expected from the mainland. A fatal error. Then, at 7:48 a.m., the first bombs hit. Minutes later, the famous code phrase is radioed back to the Japanese fleet. Tora, Tora, Tora. It means tiger, 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 and it was the triumphant signal confirming they had achieved the one thing they needed most, complete and total surprise. The Japanese pilots swarmed their number one target, Battleship Row. This was where the American dreadnoughts were moored side by side, just perfect stationary targets. They even used special torpedoes designed for the shallow harbor water, and those slammed into the ship's hulls while armor-piercing bombs just rained down from above. Then came the single most devastating blow of the entire attack. At 8:10 a.m., a massive 1,760-pound bomb pierces the deck of the USS Arizona and detonates its forward ammunition magazine. The battleship was just ripped apart in this cataclysmic explosion. It sank in less than 9 minutes, taking 1,177 of its crew down with it. And there was no let-up. Just as the first wave was leaving, the second one arrived. This wave of 171 more planes focused on finishing off any damaged ships and, crucially, destroying American air power on the ground. You see, the U.S. planes were parked neatly wingtip to wingtip to prevent sabotage, which just made them sitting ducks for the strafing Japanese fighters. Any hope for an effective counterattack was wiped out. As the Japanese planes turned back toward their carriers, they left behind a scene of absolute carnage. The smoke rising over Pearl Harbor,
That was really a funeral pyre for the U.S. Pacific Fleet and for America's whole era of isolation.
The scale of the devastation is just hard to comprehend. I mean, look at the human cost. Over 2,300 American service members killed in less than 2 hours. The material losses were just as catastrophic. The core of the battleship fleet was crippled, and the air power on the island was basically erased. But to really understand how brilliant the attack was tactically, you have to see these numbers next to Japan's losses.
And here you see it, the stark contrast. All that destruction for America, and on the Japanese side, their losses were almost nothing, just 64 men and a handful of planes. From a purely tactical point of view, it was a textbook victory, one of the most successful surprise attacks ever executed. But a tactical victory doesn't always equal a strategic one.
Yeah, military history is just filled with battles that were won on the day, only to lose the war in the long run. And this, right here, is where the story of Pearl Harbor takes its most important turn.
So, a crucial point here is that the attack wasn't actually complete. The Japanese commander, Admiral Nagumo, he decided to be cautious. He was worried about those missing U.S. carriers and a potential counterattack. So, he made the call not to launch a third wave. This decision left Pearl Harbor's vital infrastructure, its repair facilities, and its massive fuel tank farms completely untouched. And that allowed the U.S. to salvage and repair its fleet far more quickly than anyone thought possible. So this brings us to the ultimate question. Looking back on it now, with everything we know, can we really say the attack on Pearl Harbor was a success for Japan?
Well, the answer is a total paradox. In the short term, yes, absolutely. The attack was a stunning success. It neutralized the U.S. fleet and allowed Japan to just sweep across the Pacific. But in the long term, it was a catastrophic strategic blunder. Before December 7th, America was deeply divided about getting into the war. Afterwards, that nation was unified with a single-minded purpose: victory.
In the end, the attack on Pearl Harbor failed in its most important objective. It didn't paralyze the United States. It unified it. As Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, reportedly feared, all it did was awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. That date that would live in infamy became the rallying cry that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the very empire that had gambled everything on that Sunday morning.